My name is Gabrielle Lipton. I'm the editor of Landscape News for the Global Landscapes Forum, and welcome to this GLF Live. So this GLF Live is a little bit different. It's really taking a step back and looking at what we're doing here in this online space. Since the start of the pandemic, we've seen a boom in online events such as this. Our inboxes have all been flooded with invites to webinars and briefings and whole conferences. And while this was prompted by quarantine, it also really aligns with long-needed changes to cut air travel and emissions by holding more events virtually. We all remember Greta Thunberg sailing to last year's COP in Madrid to make a big statement about this. So as we continue to move more and more online, today we're going to pause and look at how this can happen to have a greatest effect. So how can we really interact and connect and learn as best as we can through our screens rather than in person? So with us, we have Brad Simmons, who manages World Bank Live, a platform which is similar to this, but has been around since 2012, and since then has hosted 900 panel discussions and 300 interviews. So it was way ahead of the recent curve. And we also have Nicholas Carr, a highly acclaimed author who has also been a front runner in examining technology's effect on modern culture, economics, and even the way we as humans function. His 2010 book, The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, was nominated for a Pulitzer. So very happy to have both of you with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nick, I'll start with you, and we can start at the present. Since we've all been living more of our lives online since the start of the pandemic, how are you really seeing this affect us?
Well, I get for most of my recent career, I've been a technology critic and kind of pointing out the drawbacks of the internet and online space as it influences the way we think, the way we perceive things. So I should start by saying that what we're in now with the pandemic is really an unprecedented time, at least in our own lifetimes, and the necessities of this particular situation mean that our ability to interact in person is constrained, and therefore, I might be critical about the online world, but I'm also very thankful that we had these tools for online meetings, online gatherings, online learning available to us when the pandemic struck. And we had, in a way, already adapted to doing a lot of things online. This whole situation has been very disorienting, I think, for many people. But you can only imagine how much more disorienting it would be if we hadn't already learned how to socialize and meet and so forth online. So there's a lot to be thankful for with these tools. Now, having said that, I think many of the flaws or drawbacks of the online space and the internet as a means of sharing and gathering information, they're still there. They haven't gone away. And in fact, in many ways, as we've come to spend more and more of our time online and to do more and more things from schooling to work to socializing and so forth, I think we've seen a magnification of some of the problems or some of the drawbacks of being online. And some of these I documented in my book, The Shallows, and they have to do with the fact that the internet and the various tools we use to supply and exchange information are very good at some things, but they're not very good at other things. And they're very, very, very good, of course, at supplying lots of information very, very quickly, kind of creating this sense that we're constantly surrounded by new information, particularly information that comes at us in kind of small pieces, comes at us in overlapping fashion with all sorts of different stimuli and different forms of media, audio, video, and so forth. And so it's very good at that. But what we know is in order to think deeply and learn deeply and read deeply and pretty much do anything deeply at an intellectual level requires the ability to shield ourselves from distraction and shield ourselves from overstimulation so that we can pay attention, so that we can really concentrate. And I think what the research has shown, and I think this has become more pronounced over the last 10 years since the Chalice came out, is that this environment makes what was already very difficult for us as human beings, which is to pay attention. We're naturally distractible, and we love to know everything that's going on. It's made it much, much harder to screen out distractions and interruptions and focus our mind. So we have this trade-off, and I think we feel it, as I say, even sharper these days, that we have access, far greater access to information and data than we ever had before, but we're struggling to tap into or release or enjoy the full potential of our mind, and particularly the higher potential of really deep thinking that does require attentiveness, contemplation, and focus. All of these things become harder and harder given the way the online world works.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we'll get back to what you're talking about with the depth of thinking later, but I want to switch quickly to Brad, because you're working directly in this space. And how have you seen it affect your coworkers and your audience and new skills that people have had to develop to meet the current situation?
Yeah, so, in the past 4 months, anybody involved in an event, whether you're a producer or a moderator or a panelist, has really had to adapt to going completely virtual. So whereas before, people were set up on stages and they had a certain amount of things taken care of in terms of how they were presented, now we have a situation where everybody involved in a virtual event has to be a lot more self-sufficient and proactive in terms of, their environment and their use of technology so that they can look and sound as good as possible. And as a result of, being 100% virtual, there's some technical pieces of it that are newly required of people. So if you're a panelist, you might be asked to learn some of the nuances of AV production in terms of setting a proper background, learning how to frame yourself, considering your lighting, is your microphone good enough? What about your internet connectivity? All those things will help you look and sound better. And likewise, for moderators such as yourself, Gabrielle, you're having to deal with those issues on top of learning the technology behind whatever platform you're using so that, you can prepare for any mishaps that might happen. People disconnecting. What are you going to do if you're about to ask a panelist something and then poof, they vanish? Or people are stuck on mute constantly. Having the ability to pivot when those situations occur is going to be critical. And, for event producers such as myself, our team has really had to quickly adapt to finding tools that will allow us to take conversations like what we're having here and, streaming them out live while adding a layer of production, multimedia, graphics, things that we've done on location before. So there's definitely been some challenges along the way. First is as Nicholas was talking about, everybody's dealing with some major distractions from your own setting, distractions that wouldn't probably normally be happening on a stage. You potentially have kids running around. I'm actually super paranoid that my kids might come down here right now. I'm not kidding. There's the guy next door mowing his lawn. There's dogs barking. There's distractions possibly coming in from your computer, things like that. And then second, there's been almost this total removal of the feedback mechanism of a live audience. So, when you're sitting in an auditorium as a panelist or a presenter, you're potentially taking an energy from your fellow panelists and especially from the live audience. And, in this setting here, if I tell a joke, I can't tell if it lands or not, so this is why these like Zoom virtual happy hours are so awkward, because you just can't have an organic conversation in there. Everybody's on mute except for one person talking, and it just creates these awkward situations. Even right now, you should be looking right into the camera if you want me to see me looking at you, but you guys are actually here on my screen, so I can't really look at you and talk to you. So it's creating these awkward situations where I think are adding a lot of stress that normally wouldn't occur in a physical environment. So I think the biggest challenge overall is that, we want people to stay engaged during our events, and we have all these distractions, and there's this potential loss of connectiveness among people watching the event. And the question is, how do we get that back? or at least something close to it? How do we use these online platforms to create a new space and a medium rather than trying to just simply replicate what has been done on the ground? But also at the same time, I think, we should be looking for things that work for physical events and figure out ways to apply them in a completely digital environment, if possible. Those are the key challenges that we're grappling with.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think this means for the future of events and conferences, and how are you seeing this feed into them?
So I think there are positives and negatives to this. First are the tangibles. With virtual events, you can open your event up to many more people that wouldn't otherwise attend due to travel or budget restrictions, right? Then there's the wealth of benefits for climate and a massively reduced carbon footprint. You don't have people traveling all around the world attending these events anymore. You're not going to have people flying in on private jets to Davos. So you have reduced emissions, reduced costs, greater efficiencies. So I think we're seeing the climate community is finally able to start practicing what they preach here. And this is, at the World Bank at least, I think has been very well received. It's allowed us to really rethink how we're conducting these events. We have our annual meetings coming up in October. And usually this is a time when, people from 180 countries descend upon Washington, D.C. to have these high-level talks about the global economy. And I think what we're seeing now is a level of acceptance and appreciation that some of these high-level meetings can be done virtually. We've seen G20 meetings happening, all year and virtually. And so we now know that these can be accomplished without the extra expense. On the flip side, we have the intangibles and the challenges that go along with all this. So in 100% virtual environment, we're missing some key ingredients that really make an event on location tick. And I'm talking about those networking experiences that in person that can really help people learn and interact and feel connected to the content. There's this, I think, missing shared experience of having collectively traveled to a conference. And there's something definitely to be said about the ease of networking and learning and building rapport at these events is a real struggle to replicate in a virtual environment. For example, at a physical event, in-person event, you can go up to a speaker after a panel and have a chat with them and say, hey, I really liked your talk. Let's talk more and let's exchange contact info. That stuff is a lot harder to do in this environment. And I think the fear is that, we're creating these experiences digitally where people who are attending them have no real sense of belonging. If they're not immersed in the content, if they're distracted left and right, that is going to affect how they retain the information they're given. So I think the question is, how can we take these immersive elements that happen in person and work really well and make them work in this new environment? I just want to give an example. We just did a event on food security with the World Bank president and the head of UNICEF and high-level guests from Africa and Singapore and South Asia, and everybody joined on a Skype call. Now, this is a technology that's been around for a while. We just have rarely ever used it. It just wasn't in our mindset. We were always thinking, how do we get people to DC? We want to have an event. Everybody has to come to DC and we're going to do it on our stage here. Once in a while we would bring in a remote guest, but it would be done over a video conference and it was always clunky and it looked and sounded horrible. So now we're all kind of forced to go remote. And so we've been learning how to utilize this technology to ramp up the quality. And we've been working on guidelines for people on how to use this technology. And I think it's changed not just how these events are technically produced, but more importantly, the way in which we strategize and conceptualize the content itself.
Mm-hmm. So Nick, going to you and backtracking a bit on what Brad was just saying, a lot of it is about these human connections that happen physically. And there's a lot that happens when you come into a room of people, just chemically and organically and biologically. And you've done a lot of research on this and how this affects our interaction with technology. Can we transfer in-person events online, or do we need to kind of reshape them to reflect how we as humans are biologically hardwired?
I think we can, and we are moving these events and meetings and other gatherings online, but we can't overcome the kind of losses that both you and Brad were talking about, the loss of the physicality, in the richness of the physicality. So I started by talking about the distractions that come from being online, which magnify the distractions that have always been around us, which is an example of information overload, a term we hear quite a lot. And I think that's always there, that there's so much information and data and things to do online. But there's also the opposite phenomenon, which is much less well known, but can be called information underload. And one thing that happens when you go into virtual space is you lose the three-dimensionality of the physical world, what we used to call the real world, as well as all sorts of sensory cues that we get when we're in three-dimensional physical space. There was in the book I wrote after The Shallows, which is called The Glass Cage, it is about automation, but looks a lot at the question of navigation and how we make sense of space. And there was this very interesting study. It was done on mice, but I think it's illuminating, where researchers kind of monitored the brain activity of mice as they went through either a physical maze, physical space, a real maze, or a virtual simulation that represented it the way we're representing our meeting now, very accurately, but was two-dimensional. And what they found was our brains, to back up a little bit, are very, very, like all mammals, have a lot of very sophisticated circuitry dedicated to navigation, because navigation, making sense of space and where we're figuring out where we're going, is so important. And what they found is that for the mice that went into virtual space, they only had about half the brain activity of the mice in physical space, even though they were doing, in a sense, the same thing, going through the same maze. And what they realized, the researchers, is that this is evidence, and I think this is true of humans and all mammals, that there is this richness to physical space that we take for granted, so we're not even aware of it. But there are textures, there's expressions, there's all sorts of things going on, important things going on that we draw information from, and these are missing when we're in virtual space. And I don't think there's any way to get them back, because it all has to do with the sensory richness of the space. So I think that explains not only some of the limitations of online gatherings and online meetings, but also some of the frustration that a lot of people feel, whether it's a virtual cocktail hour or a virtual conference or whatever, that there's something missing. And the reason I feel that is there is something missing. So that's not to say that virtual meetings, virtual conferences don't have a role. I think they have a very, very important role for all the reasons you've said. But I think we have to be aware that they may be good for some kinds of meetings aimed at certain kinds of decisions or whatever, and they may actually be very bad for other kinds, where we're trying to read the room, we're trying to read each other, we're trying to interact closely and kind of at some emotional level and so forth. And so the more we're able to distinguish, the more we're able to be aware of the limitations as well as the strengths of virtuality, I think the better able will be both to set our expectations for what can I get out of this and what won't I get out of this, but also be wiser about what we try to accomplish virtually, and what we still say, hopefully after the pandemic has ebbed, what we say, this is really a goal or a challenge or a process that is better done in physical space and in person. And the more we can make those distinctions, I think the better we'll be able to use these powerful digital virtual tools, but we'll also keep in mind that there's still space for real space.
Mm-hmm. Because we'll have the choice and we'll know how to make that choice. Hopefully. Going back to how you began talking about deep thinking and interacting online puts a lot of constrictions on that for reasons you've already said. And you've also touched upon information overload and distractions, and we can just click and click and click and click on hyperlinks within articles and go into the depths of the internet, which can be advantageous in some ways. How do you see going online affecting access to knowledge in terms of events? So interacting with people, maybe not on an emotional level, but on a level where we can really hear from people across the globe and their day-to-day experiences.
Yeah, I think one of the great advantages of the internet and virtuality and digital exchanges of information is that it does open things up. You can get more information. You can hear from more people than was practicable before we had this, and that's a very powerful advantage. At the same time, the risk, though, or even the reality, is that many of the exchanges of information become shallower, become more superficial. Because I think what happens is that we're able to share information or gather information very, very quickly, but it becomes harder and harder to fit the new information into a broader and deeper context in our own minds. Because that kind of context building really requires very active memory consolidation, the movement of incoming information over into long-term memory. And that it's through that process that we take the new information that's coming in, whether it's text or somebody speaking with us or whatever, and we connect that new information to all the other information we already know that we store in our memory. And it's those associations and connections between information, not the particles of the information themselves, that is really the essence of human knowledge. Process is it really needs attention. You really need to focus on the information that's coming into you for more than just a few seconds before you dart to the next thing, in order to consolidate it in your own mind richly and create those associations. So we have created this whole set of digital tools and apps and software that, on the one hand, make it increase the flow and the speed of information, but on the other hand, make it harder for us to develop the context in which to fully appreciate and analyze the information that's coming at us so quickly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Brad, I'll move to you. So engagement with the online audience, as Nick was just touching upon, it's more critical now in these online events to really make sure that people aren't getting distracted and clicking all over the place as someone's speaking. How do we do this?
Right. Well, for us in the communications team at the World Bank, this pandemic has really forced us to rethink how we're doing the engagement and with the events. And we do a lot of events. And, the question we keep asking ourselves is, how can we produce these virtual events that people find interesting and stay engaged with and feel connected and learn something? So Nicholas actually gave a talk, I think, a couple of years ago at Purdue University. I was watching it on YouTube when I found out we'd be doing this thing together. And he was talking about, turning information into knowledge and how the whole process of memory consolidation hinges on attentiveness, and that you can really only, like he was just saying, create associations with new information when you focus and concentrated on it carefully. And only then will information stay deep in your mind. And that really applies directly to what we're trying to do here, is to keep people's attention during these events. We keep telling ourselves we no longer have a captive audience in the room. Everybody's watching online now, and they're not stuck in their seats. So in a physical event, you as an audience member might have a phone to distract you, but it'll take some effort for you to get out of that seat if you don't find something interesting, and there's an opportunity to recapture that person's attention. But if your audience is online, you're just a click away from losing somebody. It takes a lot for people to walk out of a movie theater if they think the movie's bad. But if you're watching something on Netflix, it's just click on to the next thing. So to keep people's attention, we really have decided to change our format. It's going from a 90-minute panel discussion to a 20-minute interview. That's not to say we're going to kill that 90-minute long panel discussion entirely, but we're really focusing on, structuring the content well, hopefully, giving people an experience that will give them insight and value. And short doesn't necessarily have to mean light. We're looking at having better pacing and variety throughout an event, cutting out the opening remarks and long-winded PowerPoint presentations and including more multimedia, varying it up throughout, pulling in questions from online and comments from online viewers, doing some call outs to people that are engaging with us. And what we really want to focus on next is ramping up our live blogging and bringing in experts that can communicate with people watching while an event is live. And also you see a lot of people doing these virtual breakout sessions now, which gets people in smaller circles so they can have deeper conversations. So this is an approach I think we're going to take at our upcoming annual meetings. And we usually have 20 events, but now we're going to have 5. So we're scaling things back. We're trying to make them better. And we're looking at these panel discussions through the lens of more of a high quality broadcast you'd see on a major news network with the ability to be interactive. So those are just the basic first steps I think you can take. You can't just simply throw up a poll and consider that you've really wowed your audience with some amazing interactivity there. I think what's needed is a deeper look at how we can really make an online audience feel connected so that they can stay engaged and hopefully learn something. And it's going to take a lot of thinking and a lot more planning in the lead up to these events. And I think it might be about finding the commonality in an event. So maybe there's something people can do universally to donate to something they support. So this event has an outcome. On top of the event, we donated X to charity. Some other examples are breaking it up with trivia contests, allowing audience members to submit content that you play throughout the event. There's also a lot of people toying with recording everything and then uploading it as live because sometimes it's a lot easier to do that in advance. But we also don't want to lose the live element because it brings a certain energy into the storytelling. There's a site that I just found called MindMeister, which is like an online virtual brainstorming tool. And this is an opportunity, I think, to use in an event for people to create a forum for problem solving. And maybe, the audience is solving something together that they can then continue to solve together after the event. So I think building this sense of online community is such an overlooked success factor. The beauty of like virtuality, I think, is that the event doesn't really have to end when the event ends. It can continue with follow-ups and highlights and can serve as kind of a constant reminder to keep this event or conference alive. And you can use that as like a basis for future correspondence with people. I just think there's a real opportunity here to create this long tail so you can keep people interested before, during, and after the event.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one of our audience questions dovetails on this nicely. It's coming from Sophia, who is asking kind of what you were just saying, especially with these constricted time limits. Is going online, do you think in a way it might result in us putting out more quality information rather than quantity, which is a bit of a conversation with what Nick was saying, but
I think, well, it depends. There's both ways. In terms of technical, I think the people are seeing these as more broadcast style events. It's one thing to have a Zoom conference and then you just kind of stream that, that might not capture people's attention. I definitely think once people figured out these tools, and there are a lot of them, people are using vMix and OBS and Ecamm and Crowdcast. I really like this platform here. This is ramping up the quality in a way. A lot of times you just have a panel discussion and it's just being filmed. Now the focus is really on making it visually interesting to an online audience, having a lot of variety, mixing it up, not just having one camera angle, adding this layer of interactivity, being pretty much almost being forced to do that if you want people to pay attention. I think that yes, this will have a positive effect in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Nick, what do you think?
I certainly hope that we can figure out a way, and maybe it's in the context of online meetings as opposed to social media or something, to put the emphasis on less information, but more quality information, because the internet has not been good at that so far. And so I think there may be genuine opportunities as we think about online gatherings where we have video and we can at least see each other, even if it's in 2 dimensions. That maybe, we can figure out ways. And this is less, I think, about the software than about kind of social norms and protocols and expectations, how we think about the other people we're speaking to, and so basic kind of social norms. But if we can figure out a way to inspire people to perhaps use these spaces to get away from the internet ethic of more information is always better, to really think about what's important here, when do we need to slow down perhaps, and really say, look, this is important, let's stay focused on this for a little while rather than jumping to the next thing. I think that's all to the better. And I think, as to come back to what Brad said about adding interactivity and switching the camera angles, which is all, I completely agree, very important to keeping people focused. But there has to be a balance between the interactive tools, the ability to click on new things and look at different things on your screen, which is all also distracting, in the ability to really focus. Software creators, there's a tension between software creators' desire to automate everything and add functionality and add buttons and icons and everything, so that we can automate or pretty much any activity we can imagine, and the need to stay focused in order to think deeply and learn deeply. And we haven't been good at resolving that tension. We've tended to defer to the more is better school. So perhaps there is a way, through design and through expectations and social norms, to create spaces that value deep conversations and attentiveness, rather than just rewarding distraction and interruption.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Karen from the US, who works in online trainings for tropical forest restoration, is asking, in addition to MindMeister, which Brad just mentioned, are there other interesting tools or platforms that either of you recommend for building these quality, meaningful, interactive digital dialogues?
I think this is something that we're continually learning. We do a lot of one core thing that we have a platform called Scribble Live that we integrate into World Bank Live, and this is a tool that allows live blogging during the event, allows you to pull in social media, what's being said out there, and you can have experts join in. You can ask questions. Again, though, this is going back to Nicholas's point. This is something that also might be distracting. If you're engaged in that and you're also trying to watch the event, those two things could conflict with each other. But I think that if it's done well, it can add a layer of richness to the conversation, especially if you're looking at it afterwards. So that's a tool that I'm using. It's actually called Engage now. The tool is called Engage, and it embeds on your website, and it allows you to kind of have this conversation on the side while an event is happening. But again, we've also been looking at using this in the future. We'll probably look to use Zoom for breakout conversations, and like what Nicholas was saying about having these deeper conversations afterwards, I think will be helpful. Those really are just a few of the tools that I've seen so far.
Mm-hmm. This might be the last question, but a couple people are asking about the equality that can come from greater online communications as well. So bridging the gap between communities across the world. You can have a local community in Africa talking to someone from the World Bank in a Zoom breakout room, for example. So how do both of you think that this new medium can really equalize the spread of information and gather information from all sources and put them on the same level playing field? What are your thoughts on that? And can start with you, Nick.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and that's always been one of the attractions of the internet in general is that it opens up both information. It allows access to information that used to be easy access to information that used to be restricted geographically or economically or whatever. And it also, in the opposite way, allows people who had trouble speaking to a wide audience. It gives them at least the possibility to reach a wide audience, and again, to do it very, very cheaply and very immediately. And so that's always been one of the great attractions of the internet. And I do think that there is an egalitarianism to online meetings often that is greater than what you find in physical meetings in many cases, where there are all sorts of, I've said it, there's lots of good things that come out of being together in person, but it's also often a place where hierarchies through various symbols or whatever, or where somebody's sitting and who's sitting next to each other, where hierarchies can be imposed. And so from that standpoint, I do think that there is an egalitarianism to many online meetings and gatherings that certainly is both attractive, and I think it is helpful in thinking about what these kind of platforms are good for. They might have limitations, but I do think there are many things there are some things you can actually do better through a virtual process, simply because it is more equal, and if we can, or egalitarian, and if we can, again, figure out good ways to apply that in different settings and for different goals, I think that would be all to the better.
Mm-hmm. And to you, Brad?
I don't have much to add to what Nicholas said. I really agree with everything he said. I think one thing I would add is that I think that I feel like things have kind of changed permanently in this space, and in that regardless of when we go back to normal, if that happens, Nicholas is saying that there are certain things that just can't be done in a virtual environment well, like they are in a physical environment. And I think that there's going to be this hybrid model that appears where you're going to have people on stage, but you're going to have this lot of remote guests. And, there's definitely going to be a lower barrier of entry for integrating digital experiences back into an event on location. So the technology's gotten better, and, with the economy and the health crisis up in the air, marketers are going to need to accommodate both in-person and virtual audiences. And I think hopefully what can come out of this is that, we take the best of what we've learned by doing this, what we're doing right now, and whatever we've learned to keep people immersed in the content, we weave that back into the fabric of an in-person event. That I think will give a better overall experience for everybody involved, whether they're watching online or participating in person.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you both so much for your time. It was really lovely having you in this conversation, in which we covered a lot. And thank you to our audience for joining us on a Friday. And we'll see you back in the next GLF Live.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So much. Bye-bye. Bye.